Today there are no long distance calls, but today's those days. But again, you want to make sure to take care of your taxes. Income tax is the law of the land, has been since the days of Wilson. Wilson also got, oh yes, Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve was done here in Georgia. If you go to St. Simon's, essentially, folk, the Federal Reserve, by any stretch of the imagination, was unconstitutional. It was the first time the government really had its own, you might say, its own banking system. The Constitution clearly states, Congress shall have power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. The Federal Reserve prints up money and sets the value thereof. The Federal Reserve sets interest rates, raises and lowers them, and every time, it happened on Wednesday, every time it's time for the Federal Reserve to decide on interest rates, are they going to raise them, the stock market is always going to make a big move. If they raise them, again, the move, whichever move that the market makes is unpredictable, folks, so I'm not going to predict them. But interest comes up 2 or 3 times a year, and again, it's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve chairman has more authority in a lot of cases than does the President of the United States. Federal Reserve gave the federal government power over your purse and over your pocketbook more than it ever had before. Woodrow Wilson, oh yeah, under him the South, became more segregated than ever. Under him, Southern railroad companies were told you can put the blacks in one car and the whites in another. Folks, this is in your book. So if you don't like what I'm saying, don't take it up with the authors of the book, or take it up with history itself, or try to be glad that we don't do this anymore. Black people were told they had to ride in the back of the bus. This was still going on when I was a kid. Black people went to their own schools. Now, I must fast forward a little bit at that. Today's schools in the South are more segregated than they were in 1971, but today they're segregated by choice, not a mandate. Black parents want to send their children to black schools. So blacks go to black schools, but they do it by choice, not because they have to. Now, if I'm wrong, or if you know better, the floor is open. Your comments are welcome. Don't hear anybody. Okay. Nobody disagrees, nobody contests it. All right. I mean, what I'm telling you, folks, as best as I understand it, is true fact. And it's hard to argue with it. But then at this time, segregation, oh yeah, restroom facilities, blacks in one, whites in another. Now, in 1896, the courts had ruled in a famous case of Plessy that the South could set up separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as the facilities were equal. We all know the facilities probably never were equal. The white restrooms were the flush toilet types, the black restrooms, toilets were holes in the ground with open privies, like. Again, never separate, but never equal. Plessy versus Ferguson was finally overturned with the 1954 decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. All right. The Federal Trade Commission, as I mentioned before, I think I mentioned last time, FTC, regulated trade. It's still in existence, and its job is to make sure that trade is fair and that as best they can, that products that are done, that products are what they claim to be, good quality. And now, Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger, advocate of birth control. By itself, that may not sound like a lot, but birth control was a very controversial thing at the time. Margaret Sanger, to escape arrest, she was accused of peddling pornography when actually she was peddling methods of birth control, but she was accused of pedophilia. She fled to Europe for a while, but then as the country became more accepting of her ideas, she came back. If she'd have just stopped with birth control, it might not have been so bad, but she also, using Charles Darwin, favored eugenics. The E-U-G-E-N, yeah. Sterilizing undesirable people so they would not have children. Now, folk, this was going on as recently as when I was in high school. If you went to see a doctor and a doctor decided you were too mentally weak to be a good citizen, the doctor could legally sterilize you to where you would never have children. You would not know it. This actually went on. And oftentimes, other people around them would know it, the word would get out, and yet the couple themselves would never know that they could not have children, owing to some work done by people who followed Margaret Sanger's advice. She also, eugenics was the term used to try to, particularly, I'll be plain about it, keep blacks from multiplying, from increasing in numbers. She did a lot to encourage blacks to practice birth control, not whites. She wanted the poor to practice birth control and the rich to not. Believing, and folk, I have a zoology book at my house right now that was written in 1960. It was freshman level zoology, and it said, we really want to try to keep the poor from reproducing so that the rich, they believed the rich were better than the poor, and the rich would produce better children. The poor would produce inferior children than the rich. Nothing, folk, could be farther from the truth. Nothing. But this was actually a widespread practice. And this, by the way, this textbook was very much pro-evolution. Now, see, I'm running out of time fast. So, all right. I'll say this and then I'll quit. 1906, a huge race riot occurred in Atlanta. Whites killed some 250 black people. It's difficult to tell how many, but possibly as many as 250 blacks were killed by whites. Booker T. Washington urged the blacks to restrain, and he said to the black people, if you will better yourself, educate yourself, the white man will eventually respect you. Become more educated. Become as much as possible like the whites. Now, folk, I have to disagree here. Now, hear this from a white man. You do not appease an abuser. Now, if you're a woman and you do something to marry, let's say you're a married woman and you do something wrong, let's say you know that you were wrong, and your husband beats you, your husband is an abuser. The thing you don't do is say, I'm going to try to do better next time. No, you do two things. Have the brute arrested and leave, or do both. One or the other, or both. But you don't try to appease. Now, having said that, okay, now sometimes I could admit, I can name you a cousin of mine, a man who was beaten by his wife. She felt bad. Here's why. She was weaker than he was. Men are often told, you don't hit the woman, no matter how richly she deserves it. I follow that philosophy myself. You don't ever hit the woman. And that, a lot of women can get an advantage. They can snap at you, and being a man, hit you, and get away with it. Because as a man, you're not supposed to slap back. But nevertheless, same principle applies. Either have the brute arrested or leave. Don't try to please or don't try to placate. Now, I know that's easier said than done. In the meantime, Booker Washington, he lunched with Theodore Roosevelt in the White House. And the book shows a picture of that. Now, another one named Du Bois, a black man named Du Bois. Oops. He said, no, in order for us to get racial equality, we are going to have to get out and go to the streets and fight. And again, this was where we leave the story here. Now the story was continued. Martin Luther King favored peaceful, passive resistance without violence. And And at the same time, Malcolm X favored violence. This was done when I was a kid, but we'll continue with that story later. All right, that pretty much finishes up chapter 21. Next week, we'll start with chapters 22 and 23 and get us involved in World War I and the peace treaty afterward. And then the period after World War I, the period of the Roaring Twenties. All right.